Father Hernán Velasco was not a man born for the silence of the cloisters or the theological debates of the ecclesiastical elite. His cassock, often stained with the dust of the unpaved streets of his parish on the Mexican border in the 1980s, told the story of his origins. Coming from a humble family that had known hunger and fear, he became a priest with the idealistic conviction that faith could be a shield for the oppressed. His path to that government-forgotten, crime-ridden suburb was a journey of genuine faith, a quest to bring light to a place consumed by shadows. He believed his mission was to protect his flock, but he did not yet know how far he was willing to go to fulfill that promise. And it's incredible how stories like Hernán's spread, and today, thanks to you, we can continue to tell them. I ask that if this story touches your soul, you subscribe to the channel to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers and comment where you're watching from. To the community, Hernán was more than a spiritual guide. He was the pillar that supported the fragile hope of its people. He knew every family by name, every child by their smile, and every elder by the life story etched on their face. During the day, his parish was a refuge. He distributed food, mediated disputes, and offered words of comfort to afflicted hearts. His presence was a constant reminder that even amidst abandonment, someone cared. The faith he professed was not distant or dogmatic, but a living force, practiced in gestures of compassion and solidarity, which made him beloved and respected by all, even by those who rarely attended church. He was the personification of goodness in a place where evil seemed to reign. However, outside the walls of his humble church, the air was thick with the smell of fear and gunpowder. The neighborhood lived under the control of El Escorpión, a cartel boss whose cruelty was legendary and whose influence extended into every sphere of local power. The police, bought off or intimidated, turned a blind eye to the kidnappings, extortions, and murders that had become part of the daily routine. The nights were long and loud, punctuated by distant sirens and bursts of gunfire that no one dared to investigate. Hernán's church, with its flickering candles and plaster saints, was an island of peace in an ocean of violence, a precarious sanctuary against the tide of darkness that threatened to engulf them all. In his sermons, Father Hernán still preached patience and resilience. Standing at the altar, bathed in the colored light that streamed through the simple stained glass windows, he spoke of the transformative power of forgiveness and the strength of community unity. He insisted that good, however silent, would always prevail over the noisy evil of the streets. His parishioners listened to him intently, desperately wanting to believe his words, even as the reality outside screamed otherwise. He was a shepherd trying to guide his sheep through a valley of wolves, armed only with prayers and the hope that God, in his infinite mercy, had not completely abandoned them to their fate. His fatherly figure was especially evident in the relationship he had with the youth of the parish. He saw in their eyes the innocence that the brutality of the neighborhood threatened to steal. There was Sophia, a 16-year-old catechist, whose dedication and pure faith deeply inspired him. She saw him not just as a priest, but as the father she never had, and Hernán, in turn, felt a protective affection for her, seeing her as a symbol of the purity he had sworn to defend. In their conversations, he encouraged her to dream of a future far from there, a future where her kindness would not be a vulnerability, but a strength, nurturing in her a hope that he himself was beginning to lose. For in the silent hours of the early morning, when the church was empty, and the only sound was the crackling of candles, Hernán's faith was put to the test. Kneeling before the crucifix, he waged a torturous internal battle. His prayers became anguished questions. "Why?" he would whisper to the wooden Christ. "Why do you allow your most devout children to suffer so much? How long will our faith be tested with the blood of the innocent?" Helplessness consumed him. He felt anger growing in his chest, a dark and dangerous emotion he tried to suppress with litanies and penance, fearing the man he could become if he let that feeling take control. The failure of the institutions was an open wound in the community. One afternoon, a weeping mother burst into the sacristy, telling Hernán that her teenage son had been taken by cartel men. Desperate, she had gone to the police, but the officers laughed at her pain, telling her to forget the boy, as he was probably already dead. Hernán accompanied her to the station, where his presence as a priest was met with a mixture of disdain and indifference. The police chief, a man with empty eyes and a prominent belly, barely looked up from his newspaper. "Pray for him, Father," he said with a cynical smile. "It's all any of us can do." In that moment, Hernán understood the terrible truth. They were completely alone. To ward off the sadness that hung over the community, Hernán organized a small fair in the church courtyard. There was music, food, and children running around, their laughter echoing like an act of defiance against the oppression. For a few hours, fear seemed to recede. Hernán watched the scene with a melancholic smile, seeing the resilience of his people, their ability to find joy amidst despair. Sophia was there, serving sweets with a radiant smile, the embodiment of the hope he fought to keep alive. That night of fragile peace, of a community united under colorful lights, would be the last memory of innocence, the moment of calm before the storm brewing on the horizon finally broke upon them all. The joy of the fair dissipated like smoke in the cold night air. As the last families left, the sound of laughter still echoing in their minds, the darkness Hernán so feared reclaimed its space. The car screeched to a halt, its headlights tearing through the gloom and blinding Sophia as she helped put away the last decorations near the church gate. Masked men, moved by a casual and merciless violence, jumped out of the vehicle. There were no words, only the brutality of the act. They grabbed her, muffling her terrified screams. Hernán, alerted by the noise, ran outside just in time to see the car peel away and disappear into the darkness, taking with it the personification of his community's purity and hope. The silence that followed was more deafening than any gunshot. Despair seized Hernán in an overwhelming wave. He fell to his knees on the asphalt, Sophia's name tearing from his throat in a cry of pure anguish. His prayers, once whispered with faith, became furious demands directed at a silent, starry sky. With his heart pounding in his chest, he ran to the police station, storming the place with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. This time, however, he was met not with indifference, but with a veiled threat. The chief grabbed him by the collar, his eyes as cold as a snake's, and hissed, "Some sheep get lost from the flock, Father. It's the law of nature. Try to interfere, and you'll find that wolves also hunger for shepherds." The message was clear. The law did not exist here, only the power of El Escorpión. The news of Sofia's kidnapping spread like a poison, and a paralyzing veil of fear fell over the neighborhood. Doors were locked, windows were shuttered, and the community life Hernán had worked so hard to build disintegrated in a matter of hours. The church courtyard, a stage for celebration just moments before, now looked like a graveyard of lost hopes. It was Maria who had the courage to seek him out, finding him in the dim light of the sanctuary, a broken man before the altar. Her eyes held no accusation, only a shared pain and a question that echoed in the silence of the church. "What do we do now, Father?" In that instant, Hernán felt the crushing weight of his terrified flock, the responsibility for their safety, and the searing guilt of his own failure to protect them. 2 days later, Sophia's body was found abandoned in a vacant lot, an angel discarded amidst the trash. The violence of the act was a clear message from El Escorpión, a demonstration of his absolute power and his contempt for anything sacred. It fell to Hernán to perform the torturous task of going to the site, of covering the desecrated body, and of praying the words of the last rites, each syllable sounding like a blasphemy in the face of such brutality. The sight of the young woman, whose radiant smile had once lit up his church, now extinguished forever, was the blow that finally shattered his faith in redemption and patience. The idealistic priest who believed in the power of prayer died there. Beside Sophia, and in his place, something much older and darker began to awaken. That night, the sacristy became a chamber of grief and fury. Hernán did not pray for peace or comfort. He made a vow over the symbolic tomb of his lost faith. If God would not punish the monsters who walked the earth, then he would. He would become the hand of divine wrath that everyone feared to invoke. His mind, clouded with pain, remembered an old wooden chest stored in the back room, left there by the previous parish priest. With trembling hands he opened it. Inside, wrapped in a tattered cloth, lay a heavy old revolver. As his fingers closed around the cold metal of the grip, a chilling calm washed over him. The decision was made. Justice would not come from the heavens or the law, but from the barrel of that gun. He would no longer be a sheep awaiting slaughter. He would become the shepherd who hunts wolves. And if you feel the flame of this rebellion, know that your subscription helps us bring more stories like this forward, transforming indignation into awareness. The first night was a baptism of fire and blood. Hernán chose his target with a somber purpose, a small-time dealer known for getting the parish youth hooked, the same one who had sold the first dose to the son of the mother who had wept in his sacristy. Hiding in the shadows of a fetid alley, he waited. The confrontation was not that of a righteous angel, but of a terrified man. The gun trembled in his hands, and the first shot missed. The ensuing struggle was desperate and brutal, a tangle of bodies on the filthy ground. Hernán acted on pure instinct, driven by the image of Sophia and his accumulated rage. When silence finally returned, he found himself panting, covered in sweat and blood, standing over his first mortal sin. The return to the church was a walk of shame. Every step echoed his betrayal of the vows he had made. In the sacristy, he tried to wash his hands, but the stain seemed to have seeped into his soul. The water from the baptismal font felt like it burned his skin. Kneeling before the altar in the solitude of the early morning, he began a feverish confession to a God who seemed to have turned his back on him. The words came out broken, a mixture of justification and self-loathing. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," he whispered, but the words sounded hollow. He did not seek absolution, for he knew he didn't deserve it. He was confessing not to be forgiven, but to burn the memory of his fall into his mind, to never forget the price of his choice. The next morning, the discovery of the dealer's body sent a shockwave through the community. The initial fear soon gave way to a collective murmur of restrained relief. No one mourned the dead man. Instead, in the whispered conversations on street corners and in the market, there was a new question. It was no longer about when El Escorpión would strike again, but about who had dared to strike back. For the first time in years, the cartel's power seemed to have a crack in it, however small. People looked at each other with a spark of hope and fear, wondering if an anonymous protector had risen from the shadows to fight for them. The investigation fell into the hands of Detective Morales, a middle-aged man with the weary eyes of someone who has seen the worst of human nature and the skeptical expression of someone who no longer believes in miracles. In a police department corroded by corruption, Morales was an anomaly. Stubbornly honest man. At the crime scene, while his colleagues treated the case as just another score settling between thugs, he noticed the inconsistencies, the lack of professionalism, the desperate violence. It wasn't the cartel's clean, arrogant signature. There was something different here, something personal and passionate. He smelled revenge in the air, not business. Emboldened by the impact of his first action, Hernán became more methodical. His second foray was more calculated, born from a perversion of his sacred duty. He began to listen to his flock's confessions, not just with the ear of a priest, but with that of a strategist. Fragments of conversations, laments about the oppression of the cartel's henchmen, all became intelligence. He identified his next targets, two extortion collectors, known for their cruelty, men who reveled in humiliating local merchants. Hernán's transformation deepened. The confessional, once a place of mercy, had become his command center. This time, the execution was precise, almost ritualistic. Using his knowledge of the neighborhood's forgotten passages and rooftops, he ambushed them on a dark street, moving like a phantom in his black cassock. The action was swift, silent, and lethal. He didn't feel the panic of the first time, only a cold determination and a growing emptiness in his chest. Before disappearing into the night, he left his mark, a small wooden crucifix driven into the door of the warehouse where the bodies were. Left. The news spread like wildfire. It was no longer an isolated act, it was a message. The legend of the Avenging Angel, a divine vigilante who hunted the city's demons, was born in the whispers of the people. The affront reached the ears of El Escorpión, who received the news not with concern, but with narcissistic rage. The loss of two insignificant men was nothing. The real crime was the challenge to his unquestionable authority. He saw the angel's action as a personal attack on his reputation. His response was immediate and disproportionate. He ordered his men to double the violence, to make examples. Houses were burned, merchants were beaten in broad daylight. The message was clear. Any spark of hope the people felt would be extinguished in a bloodbath. The war for the soul of the neighborhood had drastically intensified. Meanwhile, Maria watched the priest with growing concern. She saw the change in his countenance, the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. His sermons, once focused on love and forgiveness, now contained passages from the Old Testament, discourses on the wrath of God and the punishment of the wicked. And then there were the nights. She would see him from the window of her house across the square, leaving the church in the darkest hours, a shadow moving with a purpose she couldn't decipher, but that sent a chill down her spine. She had no proof, only the intuition of a woman who knew the man's soul and felt it was being lost. The psychological burden on Hernán was overwhelming. Sleep became a rare luxury, and when it came, it was populated by vivid nightmares. He saw the faces of the men he had killed, their empty eyes accusing him in the courtroom of his conscience. But the most torturous vision was that of Sophia. In his dreams, she appeared not as the smiling girl he had known, but as a silent, sad figure, her gaze questioning whether this trail of bodies was truly in her name. During the day, he clung to the rituals of the Mass, to the litanies and prayers, but the holy words felt like ash in his mouth, unable to wash away the taste of blood and guilt. Morales's investigation, meanwhile, was beginning to take shape. The appearance of the crucifix at the second murder confirmed his suspicion that there was a religious element behind the violence. The idea of a vigilante priest was something out of a cheap movie, but logic was leading him inexorably toward the parish at the center of the embattled. Good territory. He couldn't just accuse the beloved Father Velasco, but he could watch. Undercover, he began to frequent the neighborhood, talking to residents, feeling the pulse of the community, and keeping a watchful eye on the man of God who seemed to be at the center of it all. Feeling the pressure of El Escorpion's retaliation on the people, Hernán knew he had to strike a harder blow, something that would cripple the cartel's operation. His intelligence led him to a small abandoned warehouse that served as a drug processing lab. The raid was risky and chaotic. What he had hoped would be a silent operation turned into a frantic firefight. The air filled with the acrid smell of chemicals and gunpowder. He managed to set the place on fire, watching the flames consume the poison that was destroying his community, but he didn't escape unscathed. A stray bullet grazed his arm, a sharp pain that brought him back to his fragile mortality. He staggered through the dark streets, pressing on, his wounded arm, and found refuge in the only fortress he had left, his church. In the sacristy, by the light of a single candle, he performed makeshift surgery on himself. He tore a piece from his cassock to staunch the bleeding and sterilized the wound with communion wine, stifling a scream of pain by biting down on a wooden crucifix. The physical suffering was almost a relief, a tangible penance that for a moment silenced the agony of his soul. In that instant, he was neither angel nor demon, just a wounded man, bleeding alone in the house of a silent God. The destruction of the lab was a significant victory. For the first time, El Escorpion's activities were genuinely hurt. The supply of drugs on the streets dried up, and the cartel's power seemed shaken. For the community, this was the clearest sign yet that the Avenging Angel was real and effective. Hope, once a spark, grew into a flame. The next morning, Hernán found small gifts at the church door: a basket of bread, a few candles, an anonymous note with the words, "God bless you." They didn't know whom they were thanking, but their faith in the mysterious protector grew with each passing day. It was this growing worship of the vigilante that finally led Maria to confront Hernán. She found him in the church garden, tending to the roses that Sophia had loved so much. In a soft but firm voice, she spoke not of what he did at night, but of what it was doing to the soul of the community. "They're starting to believe, more in violence than in prayer, Father," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "They're trading one monster for another. Don't you see that by fighting the darkness, you are becoming part of it? The soul of our community is at stake, and so is yours." Her words hit him harder than the bullet that had wounded him. Maria's words echoed in his mind, cracking his iron resolve. He sat alone on a church pew for hours, the internal conflict tearing him apart. She was right. He was teaching his flock to have faith in death, not life. Vengeance had consumed him to the point where he barely recognized himself. The thought of stopping, of laying down his weapon and going back to being just a priest, was tempting. Yet, as he contemplated surrender, the sound of screeching tires and a woman's scream from the street jolted him from his crisis. He ran to the window and saw the cartel's men dragging a merchant from his shop. In that instant, he knew he couldn't stop. Evil was still alive. "I must go on," he whispered to the silence, "and I know you understand this determination, and your support, by subscribing, gives me the strength to continue telling stories of struggles like this one." Meanwhile, Morales' investigation was closing in. Examining the rubble of the burned-out lab, he found something his colleagues had overlooked: a small, unique bone button, the kind used on older priestly cassocks. It was circumstantial, flimsy evidence, but for Morales, it was the missing piece. He no longer had any doubts. The Avenging Angel and Father Velasco were the same man. With this certainty, he decided it was time to stop watching from a distance and speak directly to his prime suspect. The detective's visit was unexpected. Morales found Hernán in the middle of his parish duties, the very picture of serenity. The conversation that followed was a dangerous dance of words. Morales made no direct accusations, but circled the topic like a predator. He spoke of the failure of justice, the temptation of vengeance, and how sometimes good men do terrible things for the right reasons. Hernán responded with biblical quotes and philosophical reflections on the nature of evil, maintaining an impeccable calm. The two men studied each other, each recognizing in the other a deep conviction, albeit on opposite sides of an invisible law. Hernán's actions had an unexpected side effect within El Escorpion's organization. The precise and well-informed attacks plunged the cartel boss into a deep paranoia. He began to see traitors everywhere. The trust among his lieutenants dissolved, replaced by fear and mutual accusations. El Escorpion, in his blind rage, executed two of his own men on the mere suspicion of leaking information. Unknowingly, Hernán was not only removing pieces from the board, but was also causing the king himself to tear down his fortress from within. With the cartel weakened by internal distrust, Hernán planned his next move, his most audacious yet. The target would not be muscle, but money. The cartel's accountant, the man who laundered the blood-stained fortunes. Attacking the financial pillar would be a blow from which El Escorpión would be unlikely to recover. This required a different kind of war, one of cunning and patience. Hernán spent weeks observing, learning the routes, the schedules, the protocols. He was evolving from a passionate avenger into a cold, calculating strategist. The attack was not a bloodbath, but a piece of symbolic theater. Hernán intercepted an armored car carrying a week's profits. Using a series of clever diversions, he learned from the war stories of a veteran in his parish. He neutralized the guards without killing them. Then he drove the vehicle to the central square in front of the church. There he opened the doors and, before the curious windows of the residence, set fire to mountains of cash. The image of the flames consuming the cartel's wealth under the shadow of the church's cross was a powerful and unforgettable declaration of war. The public humiliation was the last straw for El Escorpión. His power resided not only in violence but in the illusion of his omnipotence. The Avenging Angel had shattered that illusion. Blind with hatred, he put a massive bounty on the vigilante's head and brought in a group of notorious sicarios from outside the region, men known for their brutality and efficiency, who had no connection to or scruples about the local community. The hunt for the angel became the cartel's sole priority. The neighborhood streets transformed into a hunting ground, and Hernán, the hunter, was now the most prized prey. Hernán felt the change immediately. The air grew heavier, the looks on the streets more frightened. He was being hunted openly. On one side, El Escorpión's new ruthless sicarios. On the other, Detective Morales, who he knew was getting closer to the truth. The isolation consumed him. He was a one-man army, trapped between the law of men and the law of crime. His conversations with God had ceased. Now he just sent short, desperate reports into the silence, like a soldier in a trench, knowing the final battle was approaching. The inevitable ambush happened on a rainy night. 3 sicarios were waiting for him in the labyrinth of alleys behind the church. The confrontation was swift and savage. Hernán only survived thanks to his intimate knowledge of every shortcut and hiding place, using the darkness and rain to his advantage. He managed to escape, but not before one of the sicarios slashed his leg with a knife, leaving a deep cut. The experience left him shaken, aware that his luck was running out. He could no longer keep reacting. He needed to strike at the heart of the problem. As he stitched his own leg with a needle and thread, the physical pain cleared his mind. The guerrilla war was no longer sustainable. Every henchman he eliminated was replaced by another, and the violence against the community only worsened. There was only one way to end it once and for all. He would have to cut off the head of the snake. He would have to go after El Escorpión himself. The decision was not tactical. It was sacrificial. He wasn't planning for a victory and an escape. He was planning the end of the war, even if it meant his own end. The following days were dedicated to a single purpose, planning the final confrontation. He used everything he had learned, all the information he had gathered, to study El Escorpión's movements. He discovered a pattern, a routine. The cartel boss, in an act of supreme arrogance, attended midnight mass at a cathedral in the city center, a place where he felt untouchable. Hernán knew that would be the stage. On his last night of preparation, he cleaned his old revolver and prayed. He did not ask for forgiveness or salvation. He only asked for the strength to see his terrible mission through to the end. His transformation from saint to sinner was complete, and he accepted his fate. And it is in sharing these journeys of sacrifice that we find meaning. Thank you so much for being here and for helping this channel continue its mission. The night of the midnight mass arrived with a somber solemnity. Hernán's humble church was full, the families of the community seeking solace and hope in the Christmas celebration. Candles cast a golden glow on the faces of the faithful, and the scent of incense and pine hung in the air. From the altar, Hernán looked out at his flock, each face a story of suffering and resilience. His voice, as he delivered the sermon, was grave, laden with the weight of an unspoken farewell. He spoke of sacrifice, of the darkness that precedes the dawn, and of a faith that demands more than just prayers. In that moment, he was not a judge, but a lamb preparing for slaughter, seeking to absolve his people before surrendering to his final destiny. The peace was shattered with the violence of a thunderclap. The church's double doors burst open, and El Escorpión entered, flanked by his most loyal sicarios, their automatic weapons a brutal anachronism in that sanctuary of peace. Panic erupted. Screams and cries were cut short by the sound of a gunshot fired into the ceiling, the blast echoing like a blasphemy. "Nobody move!" El Escorpión bellowed, his voice filled with a venomous power. The doors were locked, turning the house of God into a trap. The congregation, the flock Hernán had sworn to protect, became a human shield, their trembling bodies the only thing between the cartel's fury and the priest who had challenged them. With slow, arrogant strides, El Escorpión walked down the central aisle, his muddy boots desecrating the polished tile floor. He ascended to the altar, the most sacred space, and with a sneer swept the candles and the Bible to the ground with a single gesture. He grabbed the pulpit microphone, and his amplified voice filled every corner of the church. "What a beautiful night to celebrate miracles, isn't it?" he mocked, looking at the terrified crowd. "You pray for salvation, but your God has abandoned you. You whisper about an avenging angel, a ghost who kills from the shadows. But I am here, real power, in the flesh." His cruel gaze finally settled on Hernán, who stood motionless near the altar, a solitary figure amidst the chaos. "And I know who he is," El Escorpión continued, the microphone screeching. "Your great protector is no angel sent from heaven. He is one of you." He pointed an accusing finger at the priest. "Show them your true face, Father. Stop hiding behind that cassock. Show your flock the murderer they so admire." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. Hernán's secret was exposed, his war in the shadows forced into the blinding light of truth. Hernán raised his gaze, not to El Escorpión, but to his people. He saw the fear in the children's eyes, the confusion on the faces of the elderly, and the horror in Maria's expression. In that instant, the battle in his soul ceased. There was no longer the priest and the sinner, the saint and the murderer. There was only the shepherd and the wolves. His choice was made not with words, but with an action that sealed his fate. Slowly he reached under his cassock and drew the old revolver. A collective gasp swept through the church, a sound of disbelief and revelation. The Avenging Angel was their priest. The man of God was the man with the gun. What followed was hell. The sacred church became a battlefield. Hernán, using his blessed knowledge of every inch of that place, overturned a heavy wooden pew, creating a barricade. The shootout was deafening, bullets tearing through the air, shattering the stained glass windows and embedding themselves in the plaster saints, who watched the carnage in silence. Hernán no longer fought with the hesitation of a man in conflict, but with the determined fury of one who has already accepted his own damnation. Each shot was a desperate prayer, each movement a defense of his people. It was the final fight between a faith twisted by violence and a nihilism that believed itself divine. At the height of the chaos, Hernán saw El Escorpión grab a child to use as a shield. Without a second's hesitation, he abandoned his cover, exposing himself. A bullet hit him in the shoulder, the pain a fiery explosion, but he didn't falter. He moved forward, becoming a human shield himself, putting his body between the thug and the child. A few feet apart, the two men faced each other, the priest bleeding and the demon smiling. Hernán raised his weapon one last time, the barrel steady and fired. El Escorpión fell backward, his body slumping against the desecrated altar, his tyranny finally silenced. The victory was absolute, but the cost incalculable. Hernán remained standing, the smoking gun in his hand, his secret revealed, his soul sacrificed before the flock he had saved and lost in the same night. Sharing these stories is our mission, and your subscription is what allows us to continue. Thank you for witnessing this moment. The sound of the last shot faded, leaving a dense, heavy silence in the air, broken only by the contained sobs of the faithful. Hernán's flock looked at him, their shepherd, who now stood before them as a tragic and terrifying figure. The man who offered them the bread of life now had his hands stained with death. There was no joy in victory, only the shock of revelation and the pain of sacrifice. Maria was the first to move, approaching him slowly, not with fear, but with a profound compassion. She looked at the wound on his shoulder and then into his eyes, seeing there not a monster, but a man who had thrown himself into the abyss to save them. In that silent gaze, the absolution he no longer sought from God was granted to him by his people. The wailing sirens grew closer, and soon the church doors were broken down by the police. Detective Morales entered, gun drawn, and stopped short at the surreal scene. El Escorpion's body lay at the foot of the altar. His sicarios were dead or wounded in the corners, and the parish priest, bloody and exhausted, held a smoking revolver. Morales's and Hernán's eyes met across the desecrated sanctuary. There was no surprise on the detective's face, only a resigned sorrow. He had finally cornered his avenging angel, and as he had suspected, found the most tortured soul in the city. The game of cat and mouse had ended in a melancholic checkmate. With what little strength he had left, Hernán dropped the gun. The revolver clattered to the floor with a metallic thud that echoed like the final period of his crusade. He offered no resistance. The war was over, and he was spent. As Morales approached, and with unexpected gentleness handcuffed him, Hernán looked one last time at his congregation. Their faces were a mosaic of pain, gratitude, and loss. As he was led out of the church, he was no longer Father Velasco, spiritual guide. He was a legend forged in blood and faith, a martyr whose fall had purchased his people's peace. The image of the priest in a cassock being led away by the police became the last and most powerful sermon of his life. In the months that followed, a strange calm settled over the neighborhood. Without El Escorpion's leadership, his cartel fragmented and collapsed. The peace for which Hernán had sacrificed his soul finally blossomed in the once terrorized streets. A new priest was sent to the parish, a good and kind man who spoke of forgiveness and new beginnings. But the shadow of Hernán Velasco remained, hovering over the community like a silent guardian. His name was whispered with reverence and caution, the story of his solitary war becoming a founding myth for that reborn community, an eternal reminder that the line between faith and fanaticism is as thin as a razor's edge. The story of the priest who eliminated criminals in the name of faith became a bittersweet legend, told to remember that justice sometimes demands a terrible price. Hernán Velasco was condemned by the law of men, but in the memory of his people, he achieved a complex form of sainthood. Was he a hero or a monster? A saint or a sinner? Perhaps the final answer is that he was simply a man, driven to extremes by a desperate love for his people and a righteous fury against evil. He proved that to cast out our demons, one must sometimes walk through hell itself. Stories like his force us to question everything, and that is why we tell them. Thank you for joining us on this journey and for making the continuation of our work possible with your subscription.